Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes of Poes Acoustics, and in this video I'm going to talk about diffusers again. Let's just call this, if you don't have diffusers in your system, why not? Or if you don't have diffusers in your system, you should. So I want to talk a little bit about what they're doing and why they're important, but they're missing so often from systems. So I get people all that, there's actually two things here. They're missing because people have mistakenly believed that the thing with wooden slats on the front is also a diffuser. And they're missing because I think it's difficult often to implement them well. So absorbers are like dime a dozen. Everybody and their brother that's in the acoustic business makes absorbers. So they're very common. And the reality is, forgetting bass traps for a minute, there's not a lot of engineering that goes into a typical absorber. So within reason, a slab of fuzz, of insulation, of a certain density in a enclosure or box or something wrapped in fabric is as good an absorber as you're going to get from anybody, and you're not going to see big differences. Where you see improvements, we'll call it some engineering that goes into the design compared to other companies, tends to be things like playing around with the density of the material, adding a curve to the front, adding an air gap, etc. All of that can change a little bit the absorption performance. But these are relatively minor differences compared to just do you have them or not in the room. So at the end of the day, adding absorption to a room is easy. And the concept of target RT60 is easy. You can either calculate it, and there's online free calculators that you can use for this. You just put in the dimensions of the room. You actually, to do it correct, you do need to put in all the absorption area that exists for stuff that's in the room, the chairs, the carpet, etc. You put that all in, and then you're left essentially with your baseline. The other way to do it is put everything in there with no treatment, measure the room with something like REW, and then that gives you a baseline too. Then the next thing you need to do is you need to go and figure out how much more absorption or sabins you need to add to the room, that's absorption area basically, to get the RT60 down to a typical target. And in most rooms, it's going to fall somewhere between 0.25 at the very low end, but that might actually be right for a very small room, up to 0.4 at the very high end, and that might be right for a very large room. No, it's very large typical home theater room. A real very large room could actually be much higher than that and still be acceptable. So most home theaters, though, are going to fall somewhere between 0.3 and 0.35. That's a very common target range, and it's a good target range, with 0.3 being a little on the dry side, especially for larger rooms, and 0.35 being a little on the high side, but it's a common target we go for. I kind of consider that a Goldilocks point. So that's easy, right? You just figure out how many absorption units you need to add and then just spread them around the room. Doesn't really matter where they go as long as they're evenly spaced and you haven't stuck them all on one surface. And that'll get the RT60 down. So that's easy. The hard part is, well, wait a minute. What do we do about the reflections that we want to keep in the room? We're not trying to get rid of all of them. And aren't there some reflections we don't want and some reflections we do want? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. Early reflections are generally more detrimental. We don't want those. So adding more absorption area around early reflection points can be valuable. So I said spread it evenly around. Well, for reducing RT60, that's true. And generally, that is part of how you do the room. But unless the speaker has really good directivity control, you do want to be absorbing more of the reflections around the early reflection points. So for instance, I always treat the front wall, because there's nothing earlier in reflections than that front wall. I also typically treat the front side walls, the front area of the side walls and the ceiling, because that's another very early reflection point, and I like to make sure there's not a lot happening there. But as we move back in the room towards the listener and then back behind the listener, now we want to have more of a mix. We want reflections in that room. We just don't want them to be really strong, and we don't want them to be coherent, meaning that they essentially match the direct sound. So what do? Well, we can break them up into smaller pieces. We can diffuse them, which randomizes their phase. And then when the ear gets those reflections, the signals it's getting is that this is a bigger, more spacious room than it really is. I think that the hard part is, where do you put those? Where do they go? So again, the absorption kind of randomly around the room or the first reflection points, that was all easy concepts for people to get. And I actually don't agree that the first reflection point should always be absorbed. I think it really depends on the speakers and what you're trying to achieve in the room. However, I do think that diffusion changes the sound of the room, for better or for worse. I happen to think for better, but I think that the science behind how they work has been a little bit less accessible, and as a result, we've kind of done a disservice in the industry to selling diffusers, if you will. A lot of the focus has actually been on making them look cool, instead of on helping people. I mean, a fabric wrap panel isn't that attractive, and yet they sell pretty well. But diffusers, it's all about these funky art shapes and funky colors. A lot of them don't work, but they look cool, and they end up getting thrown into rooms. So I would just say, if you have been thinking about treating a room and you've got the absorption in the room, if your RT60 time, by the way, is below those target ranges I gave you, it's very likely too low, and it's probably negatively affecting the overall sound of the room. But add some diffusers in. You may even want to take out some of the absorption that you've got in the room in favor of diffusers. Now, how much? Well, a person who I partner with who has a lot of experience in this area likes to use a 20% target, 20% of the wall area. 10% roughly should be absorption, and 15–20% should be diffusion. So that's a number you could use. You know, if you use too little, it's not going to have a big audible effect. You have to have enough. I've done rooms where I've done more than that, 30–40%, and the higher number comes from the fact that I'm just trying to achieve something in the sound of that room, and there's just reflections in the room that need to be addressed. And so in terms of like the number of, or it's a percentage of the wall area that's now being used in some sort of diffusion-like way is high. But you know, when you look at what we were trying to achieve, it made sense. So you know, you get sometimes some flutter echo in a room. It's not a huge issue, but it affects the comfort of the room. People aren't happy with it. So you might add some like flutter echo specific diffusers to a lot of the trim areas, corner areas up high on the wall near the ceiling and wall area might get those. And then you might add some other diffusers where you actually need them to be acting as diffusers. And then you may also add them to the front of the wall where you normally put some absorption, but you don't, like your RT60 is too low and you're trying to spread more absorption in other areas. So what you can do instead is break up those early reflections into smaller, you know, the energy is essentially the, I think I've said this before, a sound wave has a finite amount of energy in it. When it reflects off the wall, it's going to be the same amount of energy minus whatever was absorbed by the wall itself, which is relatively minimal. An absorber is removing a portion of the energy, but there actually is still energy left because there's still a reflection on an absorber. On a diffuser, in theory, a perfect diffuser has the same amount of energy. If you took all the scattered sound waves and added the energy together, it would equal the initial energy that hit it. In practice, that's not exactly how it works, but that is what we're going to assume here. So if you're absorbing too much energy because you've got too many absorbers on the front wall, but you need to somehow get rid of a lot of early reflections, diffusers are a really good option, and that's a good thing to be placing up on that front area, right between where the speakers are basically. These aren't first reflections, these are actually before the first reflections. They will break up a lot of those early reflections and give you a larger gap between the direct sound and really the primary first reflection, which is what you want. You want a nice clean area there if you can get it. It's just hard to achieve. So as I said, diffusers I think have been made to be more unapproachable than they should be. And if you don't have them in your system, I think you should add them. I think you should try it. I think it would transform the sound of the system for you and you'd really be impressed. So I hope you found this helpful. You know, subscribe to my channel and you'll get more content like this. Thanks for watching.